It's really tough to stay on top of everything happening these days, right? Especially when it comes to the federal government. It feels like every time you turn around, there's another wave of headlines and, breaking news alerts.
Yeah, it can definitely feel overwhelming trying to keep up with it all.
Totally. And so we thought it would be useful to kind of take a step back and really do a deep dive into a specific event, something that's significant, but maybe got lost in the noise a bit. And that's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, we're going to focus on this email that was sent out by the Trump administration, and it was actually sent to over 2 million federal workers.
Wow, 2 million.
Yeah, it was a pretty huge deal. And we're basing our deep dive on a really interesting discussion that happened on Glenn Kirshner's YouTube channel. He's a former federal prosecutor, by the way. And in this video, he's interviewing Representative Himes.
Oh, that's great. So we're getting kind of the legal perspective and the view from Congress.
Exactly. And the video is titled Trump Insults All Federal Workers with Resign or Else, Fork in the Road email. So I think you can probably get a sense of where this is going.
Yeah. I mean, that's preloaded language right there. Resign or else.
Right. So our goal today is basically to unpack the content of this email, what it actually said.
Yeah.
And then try to understand the potential implications of it. And we'll be relying heavily on, the analysis that Kirshner and Representative Himes laid out in their discussion.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in. So what exactly did this email tell 2 million people? Like, what was the gist of it?
Well, it was basically presented as a choice.
Yeah.
But a pretty stark one, I'd say. As Representative Himes put it, these federal workers were essentially told to think about resigning now or risk losing their jobs later.
Through, like, layoffs?
Potentially, yeah. Through what's called a reduction in force. They call it a RIF. Or they could get reassigned to a different position within the government, one that maybe they didn't want.
So not a lot of great options.
Not really, no. And the language that was used, the whole ominous ultimatum and resign or framing that Kirshner and Himes used really captures the seriousness of it. I mean, imagine getting that email right.
Yeah, and it's not just a handful of people we're talking about. It's 2 million individuals. That's like a small city.
It's really mind-boggling when you think about the scale of it. And Representative Himes' first reaction to this whole thing was pretty telling, too. He just said, nothing good is going to come from this.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he seems pretty convinced that this isn't the way to go about making changes. And what's interesting is that he actually suggested that real reform within the federal government could actually get a lot of support if it was done the right way.
What do you mean the right way?
Well, he said that if reforms were well-studied, strategic, and not just kind of thrown out there, if there was a real thought process behind them, then he thinks people would be open to it. But he contrasted that with the approach the Trump administration seemed to be taking here, which he viewed as kind of impulsive and maybe even reckless.
I see. So he's not necessarily against reform itself, but he has a problem with how this was handled.
That's right. And one specific thing they discussed in the video was this buyout program that was mentioned in the email. It was kind of presented as an option for people who were thinking about leaving anyway.
Yeah, what was that all about?
Well, Himes was pretty cautious about it, actually. He basically warned people to think very carefully before accepting any kind of buyout offer. Because you know what happens if they resign and then later on there are even more job cuts.
Oh, yeah. They might not get a good severance packet or have any kind of safety net.
Exactly. And he was concerned about that. People who've dedicated their careers to public service suddenly finding themselves out of work with nothing to fall back on. It just creates so much uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me from the email, at least the way it was described in the video, was this statement about how federal jobs relate to American prosperity.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Do you remember how it was worded?
It was something about encouraging people to move from lower productivity jobs in the public sector to higher productivity jobs in the private sector, as if that's the key to like a thriving economy or something.
Right. And that's exactly the part that both Kirshner and Himes took issue with. Kirshner, having worked as a federal prosecutor for decades, was pretty offended by this idea that government jobs are somehow less productive.
Yeah, and he probably knows a thing or two about long hours and hard work.
He definitely does. He spent 30 years in the Justice Department, so he's seen it all. And he made it clear that most of these federal employees are incredibly dedicated, and they work their tails off for the American people. But Himes went even further. He said that this statement basically implied that those 2 million workers were just a bunch of useless deadweight.
Wow, he didn't hold back.
Yeah, he was really fired up about it.
Okay.
And I think rightfully so. I mean, to suggest that people who dedicate their lives to public service are somehow dragging down the economy is just ridiculous.
It is. And you know what struck me is how both Kirshner and Himes kind of countered that argument by pointing out all the really important things that federal employees do every day, things that most of us probably take for granted.
Totally, yeah. They talked about how federal workers are the ones predicting tornadoes and making sure our food and water is safe. They brought up the Flint water crisis specifically as an example of what can happen when the government fails to protect its citizens. And they talked about law enforcement, the people who are out there trying to stop terrorists and keep fentanyl off the streets, and the FAA making sure air travel is safe.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about all that until something goes wrong.
Exactly. And their point was basically that if we start gutting these essential services, we're going to learn the hard way just how much we rely on them.
It makes you think twice about that old saying, right? Government should be run more like a business.
Yeah. And Himes had a really interesting take on that. He actually has experience in the private sector himself. So he's not just speaking from an ivory tower or anything. But he basically said that while efficiency is obviously important, this whole libertarian idea that less government is always better is just flawed. It's too simplistic. He actually used this analogy involving Elon Musk.
Elon Musk, how did he fit in?
Well, Himes said, imagine Elon Musk in this totally libertarian world where the government barely exists. He pointed out that even someone like Musk needs roads and bridges to transport his cars. He needs the FAA to regulate airspace so his rockets can launch safely. He needs the FBI to investigate threats against his company.
So the point is that even the most successful businesses rely on the government to function.
Exactly, yeah. It's not about government versus business. It's about both sides working together. The government sets the stage, provides the basic infrastructure and protections that allow businesses to thrive.
It's more like a partnership.
Right, exactly. Now, they did spend a good chunk of the discussion specifically talking about the FBI, which makes sense because, as we said earlier, the Bureau also received this resign or else email. But it wasn't just the email. They were facing a lot of other pressure at the time, too.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. Something about leadership changes within the FBI.
Yeah, some senior people were forced out, basically.
Yeah.
And that led to a bunch of lawsuits from FBI agents who claimed they were wrongfully terminated.
Oh, wow. So there was internal strife as well as external pressure?
Right, and if I remember correctly, those lawsuits were eventually consolidated into one big case. But on top of all that, there was this whole other issue about the demand for the names of FBI agents who were involved in the January 6th investigation.
Oh, right. That was really concerning. Like, were they trying to expose those agents to potential threats?
That was the fear, yeah. And it's pretty messed up when you think about it. These are the very people who are investigating a major attack on our democracy, and now they're being targeted themselves.
It's pretty ironic, and it plays right into this narrative that was floating around at the time, this idea of a deeply corrupt FBI.
Yeah, and Himes called that a founding myth of the MAGA movement. He said it's this core belief that's taken root. But when you actually look at the evidence, it doesn't really hold up.
So where did this idea even come from?
Well, Himes traced it back to this one incident involving a mishandled surveillance application. It was related to Carter Page, who was a Trump advisor at the time. Apparently, there was some serious errors made in the process.
Oh, yeah, I vaguely remember that story.
But here's the thing. The Inspector General investigated the whole thing really thoroughly. And they concluded that while mistakes were definitely made, there was no evidence of any political bias. It wasn't some kind of intentional plot to undermine Trump or anything like that.
So it was incompetence rather than corruption.
That seems to be the case, yeah.
Yeah.
And, Himes made a good point. He said any large organization is going to make mistakes sometimes. The FBI, the post office, private companies, it happens. But that doesn't mean the entire organization is rotten to the core.
Yeah, one bad apple doesn't spoil the whole bunch.
Right. And they kind of hinted that the real reason the FBI was under attack was because of their investigations into Trump and his allies. Things like the handling of classified documents and the January 6th insurrection. Those are sensitive topics.
I see. So if the FBI is investigating something you don't like, just accuse them of being corrupt.
It's a pretty cynical tactic, but unfortunately it seems to work sometimes. And speaking of sensitive topics, we have to talk about Kash Patel. Remember him?
Oh, yeah. He was Trump's pick to lead the FBI for a while, wasn't he?
That's right. And Representative Himes had some serious concerns about that. He laid out three main red flags. First, there were these allegations that Patel had compiled an enemies list, or a deep state list, of people he considered disloyal to Trump. And the fear was that he would use the FBI to go after those people if he became director.
That's pretty scary, like using the FBI as a personal vendetta squad.
Exactly. And the second red flag was this finding by a judge in Colorado. The judge basically said that Patel was not a credible witness.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, Kirshner explained it really well. He said that when a judge determines that someone is not credible, it basically means they can't be trusted to tell the truth. And there's actually a term for it, the Lewis list. It's this informal list that prosecutors keep of people whose testimony is considered unreliable.
Oh, wow. So it's like an official black mark against your credibility.
Pretty much, yeah. And it would make it really hard for Patel to do his job as FBI director if nobody believed what he was saying.
That's for sure. And what was the third red flag?
This one was a biggie. Patel actually invoked his Fifth Amendment rights when he was subpoenaed by the grand jury that was investigating January 6th.
He pleaded the fifth.
He did, and that raised a lot of eyebrows. I mean, the Fifth Amendment protects you from self-incrimination. So it basically means Patel was worried that if he answered the grand jury's questions, he might end up incriminating himself.
Which doesn't exactly inspire confidence in someone who's supposed to be leading the nation's top law enforcement agency.
Right. It makes you wonder what he's hiding.
And what did Himes think about the possibility of the Senate confirming Patel?
Well, he wasn't optimistic. He basically said that the Senate at the time was very likely to rubber stamp any nominee that Trump put forward. Even someone as controversial as Patel, he used the phrase slavishly and scantily, which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like he has a lot of faith in the Senate's ability to provide oversight.
Not really. And his big worry was that if someone like Patel became FBI director, it would politicize the Bureau. And that could have serious consequences for national security.
Yeah, if the FBI is seen as a tool of one political party, it's going to lose its legitimacy. And that's a dangerous road to go down.
Absolutely. And Himes was pretty blunt about it. He said that if we start eroding the competence and independence of the FBI, the consequences are going to be severe. He even used the phrase Hollywood-esque grotesque, which kind of paints a picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds like he's envisioning some kind of worst-case scenario.
You like something out of a dystopian movie. And that actually brings us to the last major topic they discussed, which is the possibility of a full-blown constitutional crisis.
Oh, wow, we're getting to some serious territory now.
We are. And this is specifically related to the idea that the executive branch might start ignoring court orders.
Like just refusing to comply with what the courts are saying.
Yeah, and Kirshner and Himes defined a constitutional crisis as this fundamental clash between different branches of government, where one branch just refuses to acknowledge the authority of another.
So basically a breakdown of the checks and balances system.
Right, and they pointed out that Trump had already been found in violation of court orders on multiple occasions.
Which doesn't bode well for the future.
It doesn't, and they even discussed the possibility of criminal contempt charges against administration officials who continue to defy court orders.
So it's not just Trump himself who could be held accountable.
Now, anyone who's involved in obstructing justice could be in legal trouble.
Wow, that's a lot to process. And I'm guessing it wouldn't be easy to actually enforce those court orders, right?
Well, they talked about the role of the U.S. Marshals Service. They're the ones who are responsible for enforcing federal court orders. And they have a legal obligation to do so. But it gets tricky because the president might try to claim some kind of immunity.
Like saying he's above the law.
Yeah, and that's where things could get really messy. But Kirshner and Himes made an important distinction. They said that even if the president can somehow shield himself from legal consequences, other people in the administration can't. So bureaucrats and political appointees who help Trump ignore court orders could still face prosecution.
Or civil lawsuits.
Right, and that could lead to some serious penalties, like wage garnishment or even asset seizure.
So there are real consequences for defying the courts.
There are, and I think that's an important takeaway from this whole discussion. It's not just some abstract theoretical debate. This stuff has real-world implications, and it can affect people's lives in very concrete ways.
Totally, and it makes you wonder, what can we do about all this? I mean, it's easy to feel powerless in the face of such huge issues.
I hear you. But Himes actually offered some concrete suggestions. He said the most important thing we can do is engage with our elected officials, especially Republican legislators, and not just by voting, but by actually reaching out to them, making our voices heard, and putting pressure on them to uphold the Constitution.
So holding them accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And he stressed that it's not about treating all Republicans as a monolithic bloc. There are different factions within the party, and some are more open to reason than others. So it's important to tailor our message and target our efforts strategically.
That makes sense. What else did he suggest?
He also talked about the need to change public perception of the DOJ and the FBI. You know, we talked earlier about this narrative of corruption that's been circulating. Well, Himes thinks we need to actively push back against that. We need to remind people that the vast majority of people who work in these agencies are dedicated public servants who are just trying to do their jobs.
Yeah, it's easy to demonize an entire organization based on the actions of a few bad apples.
Right, and that's exactly what Himes is trying to avoid. He wants people to understand that the DOJ and the FBI are essential to our democracy. They're the ones who uphold the rule of law and protect us from all sorts of threats. So we need to support them, not tear them down.
That's a good point. Anything else?
One more thing. He talked about the importance of building networks of people and organizations who are willing to fight back against authoritarianism. He specifically mentioned groups like Indivisible, associations of former lawyers, and the American Bar Association. These are groups that have the expertise and the resources to challenge illegal or unconstitutional actions.
So basically creating a united front against those who are trying to undermine democracy.
Exactly. And his closing thought on this was really powerful. He said that the worst thing we can do is give in to despair and apathy, because that's exactly what the authoritarians want. They want us to feel like we're powerless to stop them. So we need to stay informed, stay engaged, and never give up hope.
That's a great message to end on. So let's do a quick recap. In this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. We started by talking about this controversial resign or else email that was sent to millions of federal workers, and we explored the concerns about the demeaning language and the potential impact on essential government services.
Yeah, we also talked about the specific challenges facing the FBI, the pressure on their personnel, the leadership changes, the attempts to discredit them, and we discussed how dangerous it is to politicize law enforcement agencies.
Right, and then we got into this really heavy stuff about a potential constitutional crisis, the possibility that the executive branch might start ignoring court orders and what the consequences of that could be. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It is, but it's important stuff to be aware of. And I think Himes's final point about staying engaged is really crucial. We can't just sit back and let things happen. We have to be active participants in our democracy.
I agree. And I think a good takeaway from all this is that we need to be very vigilant about protecting our institutions. The DOJ, the FBI, the courts, these are the pillars of our democracy. And if they're weakened, the whole system is at risk.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given everything we've discussed today, what do you think are the most critical safeguards we need to have in place to make sure our federal government functions properly and to make sure that the rule of law is upheld? It's a big question, but it's one worth thinking about because the answers could have a real impact on the future of our country.
That's a great question, and I hope our listeners will take some time to really consider it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
Thank you for having me.
It was great having you on.
All right.
Take care.
Hey, you too.